Hello, and welcome to another chapter of our online Lenten Bible study. Today, we will be talking about a group of books that are part of the sapiential section of the Apocrypha, meaning books that are mostly written in verse instead of prose, as other books that we have been reading so far. There are also a section of books that, if you are more inclined to verse in your regular reading habits, you will enjoy them more because of the way they are written and the style of writing that they employ. We are talking then about the book of the Wisdom of Solomon, the Prayer of Manasseh, we are talking of Sirach, and we are talking about Psalm 151. So we are joining together all the sapiential books of this section of the Bible to study together as a whole. They are interesting because they mix together two elements that are happening or present within the people of Israel in the Palestinian Peninsula at that time. They are mixing traditional Hebrew imagery and tradition, as we see in the Psalms, with the influence of the Greek culture. Because, like it or not, the Greek culture has become part now of the Palestinian Peninsula. So these books will try to speak both languages. Will try to use imagery from the traditional Hebrew image and perspectives, and also elements on language and on imagery also from the Greek tradition, to be able to make the crossover to a different culture, especially to the diaspora community of the Hebrew people. So these are very interesting books that will continue to expand the vocabulary that we have to speak about God and to speak about our relationship with God. So let's dive into them. The first book that we're going to talk about is the book of Sirach, or the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, or book of Ecclesiasticus. This book was written about year 200 before Christ, along with other books that we have already seen in our study. We might start seeing that this is a time of literary proliferation. So there's a lot of books in the Bible that are written in this period of time, around 200 and forward before Christ. And it's written originally in Hebrew by probably a sage or somebody with a lot of wisdom that lives in Jerusalem. And it's going to try to sort of piece together elements of the wisdom tradition of Israel, of temple worship, with this nudge to the Greek element of wisdom and living a righteous life, which are elements that come from Greek philosophy and that are now coming into the experience of the people of Israel. Just by the name, you can see that there's some difference here. There are two ways of calling this book: the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, or Sirach, for a shorter way, or the book of Ecclesiasticus. And that refers to the usage of this book and the content that it has inside of it. So the book is called originally the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, because that is the person that is writing the book. Jesus, son of Sirach, is the way he describes himself as the author of the book. But it's also known as Ecclesiasticus because of the content of the book. So this book will be filled with maxims and with indications about how to live a godly life, or a life full of wisdom, which is this nudge to the Greek concept of wisdom, right? So this book would be basically an invitation by Jesus, son of Sirach, to live a godly life, to live a life under the wisdom of God. And then it's full with these applications or maxims, very well crafted maxims about how to achieve that life. And because of that, the church used it for its baptismal preparation for centuries. So because of that, it's called Liber Ecclesiasticus, or the book of the church, because it was used for baptism candidates to prepare themselves for baptism, because it was considered to have a very neat condensation of how to live a godly life. This is a book that is beautiful because of these sentences that it provides, that are usually very quotable. So if you go online and you Google quotes from the Bible about friendship, relationships, family, you're bound to find quotations from Ecclesiasticus, or from the book of Sirach, and it's referring to this book because of the way it's written. You'll find a lot of quotable material in this text. More importantly, this is a text that is focused on living a godly life, a life under the wisdom of God. It is a spiritual book that is trying to teach the people of Israel that God is not only something that we know, but also a way of living. That this way of God is not only something that we should keep here in our rational, in our heads, but also in our hearts and also in our hands and feet as we walk and live in the world. So it's a very practical book, a very spiritual book, and a book that I think you would actually enjoy reading. So give it a try. Psalm 151 is an addition to the book of Psalms. It's actually not in the Anglican or Roman Catholic Apocrypha. It is part of the Orthodox Apocrypha, the Psalm 151, because it was never part of the Western canon. It was only part of the canon of the Eastern Church. I will include it here mainly because most of the Bibles that we have today in the modern years are ecumenical Bibles, and in the set or the section of the Apocrypha include this Orthodox book of the Apocrypha. So it is not really part of the Anglican tradition or Roman Catholic tradition, but it's there. So I think it would be a great opportunity to look upon it. It's just a single psalm, very short. I think it has like 10 or 12 verses, and it talks about the experience of David and Goliath. Which is an experience that actually is not described in other psalms in the Bible so explicitly as this one. So it's a psalm of as if David was reflecting on his experience with Goliath. And it's just that. It's a very short section of text, and it's interesting because of the topic that it talks about, that is illustrative of that reality, and also it's a very nice composition that is very short and only resides truly in the Orthodox Church version of the Bible. The Book of Wisdom is another fascinating book. It's traditionally known as the Wisdom of Solomon, but while it speaks about wisdom, it was most certainly not written by Solomon. So this book is actually written about 50 years before the birth of Christ. So very close to the birth of the Messiah, and certainly not written by Solomon, that it's probably 400 years in the past. It is most probably written outside of the Palestinian Peninsula. We think that it was actually written in Alexandria. I mean, not here in Alexandria, Virginia, but in the actual Alexandria in Egypt. And that whether it was a single person or a number of authors together, it is clear to us that it was written mainly for the diaspora community of Jewish people in Alexandria and Egypt, Northern Africa. This is a community that is very far away from their ancestral land, and they are immigrants. So this is a book written for immigrants, and this is very important, especially for us today and also for the Jewish people in their own time. So it's written for Jewish people that are immigrants in a different land and that are very far from their ancestral land and traditions, very far from the temple that they used to visit traditionally once a year, but now can only visit maybe once in a lifetime. So because of that distance, they are very prone to letting go of their faith and traditions and instead move on with the culture and tradition of the place that they are living in. And then comes this book to try to invite Jewish people in the Northern Africa, in Alexandria and Egypt, to hold fast to their faith and their traditions. But it's doing so in a very interesting way. The book is written in Greek and is using Greek imagery for God, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. But it's written in the traditional Hebrew structure of verses. So it reads like another Hebrew scripture book, but it's actually written in Greek, and the language that it's using is very Greek in nature. So it's trying to explain the God of the Israelites and the experience of the Jewish people in Greek terms. And for that, it uses the word wisdom, which is something that we also see in Ecclesiasticus, but is more preponderant here in the book of wisdom. And wisdom in Greek is said Sophia, and which is not only a name but also known for us. We might remember, for example, Hagia Sophia, which is what used to be the Cathedral of Constantinople, this huge church that now is a mosque, and it's called Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom of God. So we see how when Hebrew people are trying to explain God in Greek terms, they go to this attribute of God, that is the wisdom of God, and use it to talk about God's power and God's acting in the world through Greek terms. So the entire book will talk about wisdom. You might say that is an early exercise on evangelism, an early exercise on missionary spirit, for sure, because he's trying to translate the traditions of the people of Israel into a different culture in Greek. And it ends up with a beautiful description of what the life in God is, of what are the benefits of the life in God, and also why we should continue to hold fast to these traditions. But it's doing it from the perspective of wisdom. And in wisdom in English, in Spanish, and also in Greek is a feminine attribute. So throughout the years, many feminists will find in the book of wisdom a very strong hold in their belief. It is true that, and we'll talk more about this in the class, that wisdom is not the only feminine attribute of God. To see this femininity in God and seeing femininity in the words of wisdom as also attributed to God. So I think it has this fresh view for us that I'm sure that we're going to enjoy. Another element of the Book of Wisdom that we should consider is how it treats the concept of Messiah. The concept of Messiah is not a new concept. It is not that it was birthed during the time of the Apocrypha. Actually, we see very clear prophecies of the Messiah in the prophetic literature of Isaiah and Jeremiah and other prophets. Nonetheless, this period of the Apocrypha continues to refine this picture of the Messiah. So as part of this week's readings, I want to invite you to take a look at a section of the second chapter of the Book of Wisdom and look at the description that appears there of the righteous man, and then look at Jesus, and you will see how Jesus fits into the image of the righteous man that the Book of Wisdom is portraying, and how then, for people that were reading this literature, Jesus could have been perceived as the Messiah. It is another development in this growing corpus of knowledge and tradition of the people of Israel that go from the time of the resurrection up until the coming of the Messiah, and that is clear in this second chapter of the Book of Wisdom. Finally, we have another very short book to study today, and that is the prayer of Manasseh. And you might also find that we have a city very close to here called Manasseh, and very close then to the prayer of Manasseh. This prayer is a very short text, about 15 verses only, and it is attached to the Apocrypha text, and is the classical text for confession of sin. In the book of Second Chronicles, it is described the life of King Manasseh, and it says of how he was one of the most idolaters, the strongest idolaters kings of the people of Israel. He was a very well-known and public king that separated himself from the tradition of Israel. He was a public sinner, you would say, because of his idolatry. And the book of Second Chronicles tells us, and then when he was liberated from prison, because he was in prison, when he was liberated, he asked God for forgiveness. And then he writes a prayer, and the book of Chronicles says that is kept on the annals of the history of Israel. Well, the book of annals of the history of Israel didn't make it to our times. That is a lost book that we never found. But we did find his prayer, the prayer of Manasseh. That is such a beautiful prayer that is actually included as one of the morning prayer canticles in the Book of Common Prayer. It is common to pray it during Lent, and it might be interesting for us to take a look at the prayer of Manasseh now in the time of Lent, because it takes the time to talk about the power of God, to ask forgiveness, and to also move us into restoration and new life after the confession of sin. So take a look to the prayer of Manasseh. That is a classical prayer for asking for forgiveness of sins. As with other sapiential literature or wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible and in the Old Testament, the First Testament, we are excited about these 4 texts that we are studying today, because they connect us with our inner selves, with our emotions that are probably more clearly present on the structure of verse than in the structure of prose. So my invitation for this week is that we take some time to read and enjoy and savor these very well crafted books, sapiential books of the Apocrypha, that will hopefully invite us to consider how we see life, what is the value of living a godly, holy, and righteous life, and what is the place of our faith within our lives. Hopefully, it would also invite us to look at God in different ways, using different imagery, different pronouns, different ways of looking at the vastness and the wideness of God in our lives. And finally, they are a great invitation to continue to ponder the value of the life that we have chosen in this time of Lent. We are called in Lent to recommit to our baptismal life, to the life of God that we have chosen after being loved by God. And it is a good time to take these texts and continue to ponder the value and the great experience that the life of faith is.